Okay, so this week we're going to talk about operating procedures, and the we start out with talking about um, sideband, and we're not talking about it so much from a technical point of view today, although there are some little bit of technical questions, but we're talking about it mostly from an operating procedure point of view. So if you remember, this is our sideband figure here. And generally, we restrict voice communications. You know, you run the mic input through a 3 kilohertz filter, and that puts constraints on the audio frequencies that we feed into the transmitter. And if you recall, you know, single sideband is an AM type of amplitude modulation. Amplitude modulation normally creates two sidebands, the lower sideband and the upper sideband. And then you have the carrier frequency, of course. And then to get a single sideband, what we do is we filter out the lower sideband and the carrier frequency. And all we're left is a single sideband transmission that's 3 kilohertz wide. It's the bandwidth of a single sideband transmission. You know, and if you look at these things on a waterfall display, and I should have made one and brought it in, but you see they're like 3 kilohertz wide. You know, it's really quite interesting because because we're only using a single sideband. It's very efficient in terms of bandwidth, only 3 kilohertz instead of 6 kilohertz for an AM signal. And it's very efficient as far as power is concerned. So in a regular AM signal, you know, half the power is going to be in the carrier signal, a quarter in the one of the sidebands, and because these are the same, you know, sort of mirror images of one another, they're redundant. So 25% of the power of the signal is carrying the information. So that's why they decided to get rid of those. Then you can put all the power into a single sideband. All right. So question, which mode of voice communication is most commonly used on the HF amateur bands? Answer, single sideband. For all those reasons. More efficient in terms of power, narrower bandwidth, and not that much harder to generate. Question, which of the following statements is true of the single sideband voice mode? Answer, only one sideband is transmitted. The carrier and the other sideband and carrier are suppressed, so filtered out. Which of the following is an advantage when using single sideband as compared to other analog voice modes on the HF amateur bands? Answer, less bandwidth and greater power efficiency. So those are kind of the technical reasons we use sideband. So I said we're not going to talk too much technical, but we did talk a little bit about it. The next section, though, this is really just a matter of practice, and by that I mean the practice of amateur radio operators, not practicing talking on the radio. For almost every application, on every band, we use upper sideband, except for a few exceptions, of course. The exceptions that prove the rule. So, question: which sideband is most commonly used for voice communications on frequencies of 14 megahertz or higher? Answer, upper sideband. Which mode is commonly used for voice communications on the 17 meter and 12 meter bands? Answer, upper sideband. Those are on frequencies higher than 14 megahertz. Question, which of the following is most commonly used for SSB voice communications in the VHF and UHF bands? Answer, upper sideband. Again, that's higher than 14 megahertz. Question, which of the following modes is most commonly used for voice communications on the 160 meter, 75 meter, and 40 meter bands? Answer, lower sideband. So Lower sideband is on 160, 80, and 40. Those are the 3 bands we use lower sideband. No technical reason why we do it that way. We just do it that way. And you can operate lower sideband on 20 meters if you want. I mean, there's no restriction against it. It's just that mostly we don't do that. That's the next thrust of the next question here. Why do most amateur stations use lower sideband on the 160 meter, 75 meter, and 40 meter bands? Answer, it is good amateur practice. And actually, this should be 75 meters here. You know, this is I always call it 80 meters because I operate in the 80 meter portion, the CW portion. But it goes from 3.5 megahertz up to 4 megahertz, right? Well, if you remember that equation, 300 divided by 4 is 75, right? So we call the phone portion 75 meters and the lower portion 80 meters. It's kind of confusing because it's really all one band, right? All right, any questions about that? Upper sideband except on 160, 75, and 40. That's all you got to remember for these questions. I'm going to skip over the next question. We'll cover it a little bit later. This is what I was talking about before about grouping questions a little bit more appropriately. When we talked about this before, and certainly talked about it on the tech test, you know, when you're operating phone, what you want to do is you want to set that mic gain control properly, right? You don't want to set it too high. You don't want to set it too low. Too high, you'll get distortion. Too low, you won't get enough output power because the output power is related to how much you're modulating the signal. So question, what control is typically adjusted for proper ALC setting on an amateur single sideband transceiver? Answer, transmit audio or microphone gain. And ALC here stands for automatic limit control. So there's the circuit in there that will prevent you from driving it too hard. You really don't want to do that. And usually what you do is you set it for just below where this automatic limiting starts to kick in. If you can do that, then that's sort of like the sweet spot. And another phone question here. Which of the following statements is true of voice box operation versus PTT operation? Well, VOX stands for voice operated transmit. And PTT is push to talk. So you'll use one or the other, right? So the push to talk, you'll grab the microphone and push it and talk. Otherwise, if you just have the VOX set, it'll automatically switch when it detects your voice. So the answer to this is it allows hands-free operation. You know, because you don't have to push the push to talk button. All right, any questions about that? Okay, so one of the things we do when we want to make a contact on phone is, and CW as well, actually, we say we call CQ, okay? And what does that mean? It means we're calling any station. So if you hear somebody on, say, 40 meters, you hear calling CQ, 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 this is KB6NU. That means I'm calling for any station to call me back. But sometimes you'll hear the call CQDX. And what that means is that they want to talk to specifically to foreign stations outside the continental 48 states. And so sometimes you'll hear that. I'll say CQDX, CQDX. You will never hear me say it because I don't say that, but sometimes you'll hear other stations say that. So question, who should respond to a station in the contiguous 48 states to stations who call CQDX? Answer, or wait, generally, who should respond to a station in the contiguous 48 states who call CQDX? Answer, any station outside the lower 48 states. That's one way to establish a contact. Another way is to actually break into a contact. Okay, if you hear two stations talking to one another and you think it's an interesting conversation, you might want to join them. You can quote unquote break into the conversation. And if they hear you, they'll let you join the conversation. So question, what is the recommended way to break into a phone contact? Answer, say your call sign once. So like I say, if you hear two stations, if you hear me talking to Ralph, AA8RK, and you want to join the conversation, all you got to do is throw in your call sign, KE8PFA. And if we hear you, then we'll let you join the conversation. Any questions about that? And this is true on HF as well as the FM repeaters. It's the same procedure both ways. So let's talk about CW operation. CW is Morse code, and there's a whole, I don't know what you want to call it, rigmarole about using Morse code. A protocol, let's put it that way. There's a whole protocol to using Morse code. And especially with calling CQ. So, and you really should do this on phone too, but this question is particular about CW. Is first you should listen on a frequency. If you don't hear anything going on, listen for a while to see if you hear any stations. If you don't hear a station after a minute or two, then on phone you'd say, is this frequency in use? And then if you don't hear anyone come back to you, then you can start calling CQ. On CW, we send what's called a Q signal. And we'll talk a little bit more about Q signals later on. But we send the Q signal, QRL question mark. And that three-letter Q signal, QRL, stands for, followed by a question mark, means, is this frequency busy, actually? Is this frequency in use? And if it is, somebody will jump on and tell you, it's either send QRL or simply the letter C. And that's your indication that the frequency is in use, okay? So question, what is a practical, and why do we do this? Well, we don't want to interfere with an ongoing contact, right? So we want to avoid interference. Question, what is a practical way to avoid harmful interference on an apparently clear frequency before calling CQ on CW or phone? Answer, send QRL question mark on CW followed by your call sign, or if using phone, ask if the frequency is in use followed by your call sign. And of course, you're supposed to send your call sign to identify your station, and identify the transmission. Did people do that? And they've sort of slacked off on doing that. But you're technically supposed to send your call sign. Question, what does the Q signal QRL question mark mean? Answer, are you busy or is this frequency in use? And most of the time nowadays we use use it for is this frequency in use. The busy bit goes back to the days when CW operators passed radiograms, actually, like radio telegrams, and if a station was asking if the station was busy with another station passing this traffic. Any questions about calling CQ? All right. So let's talk about the band plan. If you remember again from the tech test, they talked about the band plan there as being a voluntary agreement amongst radio amateurs to use certain frequencies or ranges of frequencies for certain activities. The whole reason being not to interfere with other stations doing other things. So they set up this band plan. This information, where is it here? All this information right here is right from the ARRL website. So this is sort of the official ARRL band plan. But just to show you how out of date it is, it doesn't have the FT8 frequencies on it. And FT8 is like the most popular mode these days. I mean, there's more contacts made on FT8 than I think even all the other modes combined anymore. It's that popular. So, you know, I take this with a little bit of grain of salt, but even so, this is we still try and follow this as well as possible. Again, to avoid interfering with one another. So question, which of the following complies with good amateur practice when choosing a frequency on which to initiate a call? Answer, follow the voluntary band plan for the operating mode you intend to use. So, you know, like let's take this as an example. So here's between 7080 and 7125, we got RTTY and data. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means you probably don't want to start calling using teletype around 7025. That's where the CW guys are. You know, you don't want to jump into the middle of that. Same thing on 30 meters. 30 meters, the teletype is up toward the top of the band. On 20 meters, it's even more, there's even more things going on here, right? So slow scan TV at 14.230. The beacons, we talked about beacons last week, is around 14.100. So, you know, all these things are going on there, and if you stay with this voluntary band plan, you'll avoid interfering with other hams doing other things. Question, what is the voluntary band plan restriction for U.S. stations transmitting within the 48 contiguous states in the 15.1 to 50.1 to 50.125 megahertz band segment? Answer, only contacts with stations not within the 48 contiguous states. So this is called the DX window. And what's the purpose of it? Well, it's to leave that little bit of space, that's only 25 kilohertz, for stations to be able to hear stations outside the U.S. Basically, is what it amounts to. So if the conditions are good and you think you can make contacts with foreign stations, check out that little area of the band, and there might be some DX stations in there. So that's 50.1 to 50.125. DX window. Any questions about that? Okay. So there's a couple of, this whole chapter is really a sort of a bunch of random questions about operating procedures. So there's almost like no kind of real easy thread through here. So here's a few, like I say, random questions. When selecting an SSB transmitting frequency, what minimum separation should be used to minimize interference to stations on adjacent frequencies? Well, where's my mouse here? As we said, the bandwidth is 3 kilohertz, so the answer is approximately 3 kilohertz. You know, if you hear a station on this frequency, well, you can start transmitting probably on this frequency, and you're not going to overlap with them. You're not going to cause them any interference. Question, when selecting a CW transmitting frequency, what minimum separation should be used to minimize interference to stations on adjacent frequencies? Answer, 150 hertz to 500 hertz. And you know, I actually disagree with this answer. I would say if you can, leave 1 kilohertz between you and another CW station. And the reason for that is, this is fine if both stations are using modern equipment with very good DSP filtering, right? But, you know, if guys are using older equipment, and which happens a lot on CW, they're, you know, using vintage equipment, that radio might be as broad as a barn, as we say, and 150, you know, this actually might be like more like on the order of 2 kilohertz. So even 1 kilohertz is, you know, maybe not enough in this case, and certainly 150 hertz isn't going to cut it. If you start transmitting 150 hertz from somebody that's using older equipment, they're going to hear you, no doubt about it. So, you know, you'll be safe with 1 kilohertz, but even more if you can. That's sort of the romantics rule for spacing out CW signals. And again, the whole idea here is not to interfere with other stations, right? Even though you follow all these practices, sometimes interference is unavoidable. In fact, something like that happened already this evening. I was downstairs before the class got started, playing around with radios, and the band changed, the propagation on the band changed. And all of a sudden, I was hearing stations that weren't there like 5 minutes ago. And so when that happens, you might all of a sudden start to hear stations in contact on the frequency you're in contact with another station on. So that's the thrust of this next question. What is good amateur practice if propagation changes during a contact and you notice interference from other stations on the frequency? Answer, attempt to resolve the interference problem with the other stations in a mutually acceptable manner. So, you know, normally what happens is you just end the contact. At least this is what we do at CW anyway. We usually just end the contact at that point. But sometimes if it's a good contact, you know, you don't want to end the conversation just then. You'll say, well, let's, this is another Q signal, which we'll talk about later. We'll say, let's QSY. That means let's change frequency. And we'll go up or down a kilohertz, maybe 5 kilohertz, and resume the contact. And a related question is, well, who has the right to the frequency? You know, if you have 2 different contacts all of a sudden on the same frequency, who gets to be the I don't know what you want to call it, the person that stays on the frequency, right? Well, there's no set rule about that. And in fact, sometimes both contacts change frequency. And this is the principle behind this next question. Question, which of the following is true concerning access to frequencies? Answer, except during emergencies, no amateur station has priority access to any frequency. So my contact is just as entitled to that frequency as your contact. That's the way it is. So you work it out to see who gets to keep the frequency. And it all comes down to just being polite, right? Just be polite. Another thing that often happens is you may be on a frequency and all of a sudden a net wants to start operating on that frequency. And you're on their published frequency, right? And now theoretically or officially, legally, you're just as entitled to that frequency as the net, but the polite thing to do is for you to move off that frequency and allow the net to go on that, to take over that frequency. Why is that? Because that, if that net has 20 or 30 stations that are going to check in, it's 20 or 30 stations that are going to expect to hear the net on that particular frequency. They could go searching a little bit high or low for the net, but the courteous thing to do is for you to move off the frequency and let the net have the frequency. All right, any questions about that? So now there are a few questions here about emergency communications, emergency contacts. And again, I was, as I was going through this, I see I kind of got these a little bit out of order. We're going to get back to CW in a minute here, but we'll talk about these emergency operating or emergency conditions questions first. Question: when is an amateur station allowed to use any means at its disposal to assist another station in distress? Answer: at any time during an actual emergency. And if you remember the question on the tech test, there was sort of two questions. That, at least the way I organized it. One of the questions was, when must you follow FCC rules? The answer is, well, you must follow FCC rules at all times. And then the next question was, it was basically something like, when can you ignore the FCC rules? Answer: when there's an actual emergency. So it's kind of a little catch-22 there. And that's the deal with this question. So you really have to always follow FCC rules, but if there's an actual another station in distress, there's an actual emergency, you can use any means necessary, whether you have the privileges to do it or not, whether it's higher than allowable power, whatever it takes, do that. So so the catch-22 is, you got to always follow FCC rules, but the FCC rules say you can break the rules if there's an actual emergency. Question: what frequency should be used to send a distress call? Answer: whichever frequency has the best chance of communicating with this distress message. So again, it could be within the amateur radio bands, it could be outside the amateur radio bands. If it's outside the amateur radio bands, it's a real emergency, just do it. Question: what is the first thing you should do if you are communicating with another amateur station and hear a station in distress break in? Answer: acknowledge the station in distress and determine whatever assistance may be needed. So do whatever you need to do to help that station in distress. And then there's a sort of this out of the blue question about emergency communications, more formal emergency communications. Who may be the control operator of an amateur station transmitting in RACES to assist relief operations during a disaster? If you remember, what RACES means is the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service. So the question: only a person holding an FCC issued amateur operator license. So the idea behind this question is, if you are assisting a federal agency, FEMA or whatever, and this is an official RACES operation, you still have to be in control of your station. You can't just let anybody use the station. So keep that in mind. Only a person holding an FCC issued amateur operator license may be the control operator of the station.
I have a question.
Yep.
The question I could operate on a frequency for emergency regardless of what license I hold?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. As long as it's an actual emergency. In fact, if you and I've, in all my years of hamming, I've never really had this happen to me, but it happens occasionally, and you hear about it in the amateur radio magazines. Not only can you do it, if you do it, you'll be a hero. they'll write you up, you know, wherever you are. Oh, Idaho amateur saves a life. You know, that's big news in the ham radio community. Any other questions? All right. So now let's talk again about Morse code. Morse code is one of those things, you know, like every sort of endeavor has something like Morse code. You know, when I sometimes give presentations on Morse code, I call it having fun with Morse code. And if you remember the old Car Talk radio show, these guys used to have what they call puzzlers, and they used to call them folkloric, historic, and something else. I forget what. Well, CW is like that. Morse code's like that. It's historic and folkloric, and you know, part of the tradition of amateur radio. And you know, things go along with that. So my point here is, even though it might seem hard to do, and for some people it is hard to do, you might want to just try it. And reason is because it is historic and folkloric, and it is a real efficient mode of operation. So like if you are going to do certain activities, like go to parks, right? We have, you know, the parks on the air are like a big thing in amateur radio now. People take small stations, often low power radios, out to parks and operate from there. Set up a temporary antenna and operate from there. Because you're often using lower power, Morse code is a great choice because it's more efficient than single sideband. You'll be able to, quote unquote, get through with CW where you might not be able to with single sideband. That's one thing. Summits on the air is another. It's the same kind of thing. You're going out to some summit somewhere and operating from the top of a mountain somewhere, and you're taking whatever you can. So the summits on the air are even more strict about how you can operate, the equipment you can operate. And summits on the air, they say you can only take basically what you can carry. Right, so you're not going to be carrying a linear amplifier with you probably. Whereas parks on the air, there's no restriction. I mean, you can drive up in your car, and a car could have a linear amplifier in it, and you could run 1,000 watts. And the parks on the air, people don't care. But even so, most parks on the air is done with lower power equipment. Anyway, the whole point here is that CW is it's a fun, and I think it's a fun thing to do as well. You know, it's a skill. Once you master it, it's a skill you can be proud of. That's where I'll leave that. But there's several questions here about operating Morse code, like what's the proper mode of operation, or how do you best do it. One of the things is, never send, and there's always a temptation to do this, but never send faster than you can receive, right? If you're capable of operating like at 10 words a minute, but usually what happens is you can send faster than you can receive. You might be tempted to send at 15 or 20 words a minute, but if you do that, the operator on the other end is going to assume that you can receive that fast as well, and they'll start sending that fast back to you. So if you're only good to 10 words a minute, don't send any faster than 10 words a minute. That's the idea behind this question. What is the best speed to use when answering a CQ in Morse code? Answer, the fastest speed at which you are comfortable copying, but no faster than the CQ. And I've had this happen to me many, many times. In fact, it happened to me just this evening. When I get on, I usually start sending about 21 or 23 words a minute. Sometimes I even go faster if I feel like going faster. But if someone replies to my call at a slower speed, I'll crank the speed down to match their their speed. And that's again a courteous thing to do, that we do that in Morse code. And why do we do that? Well, because we want to make contacts, not necessarily make really high speed contacts all the time. So we'll do that. So never send faster than you can receive. Let me get rid of this. The next thing I'm going to talk about here is zero beating. And I don't have a diagram for this, so I'm just going to draw this. What zero beat means is matching your transmit frequency with the transmit frequency of the other station. So if I'm sending on 7030 kilohertz and you hear me calling CQ, you want to set your transmitter as close as possible to 7030 kilohertz. Why is that? Well, because I'll have my side tone set to whatever tone I like to hear. And I usually set mine to about 550 hertz. And if you are off frequency, then I'm not going to hear 550 hertz. I'm going to hear, if you're low or high, I'm going to hear 550 plus or minus X hertz. Now, that's where the receive, if you remember again from the text, that's where receiver incremental tuning comes in. I can still set my receive frequency to whatever frequency you're on and still hear 550 hertz. But you want to get as close as possible. Another reason for that is it'll take up less bandwidth, right? If you're like, say this is minus 100 hertz, well, now we're taking up all this bandwidth instead of just a single bandwidth, a very much smaller bandwidth. So anyway, question, what does the term zero beat mean in CW operation? Answer, matching the transmit frequency to the frequency of a received signal. And it really kind of, honestly, it really kind of drives me nuts when people don't do that. Because I just don't understand why they do that. I mean, if they're using modern equipment anyway, it's very easy to zero beat. If you're using older equipment, what happens with older equipment sometimes is that even if you zero beat right off the bat, the frequency of the transmitter, if you're using an older vintage radio, will drift during the contact. But if you're using digital, digital radio like I've got, it'll always be right there. But those older tube radios, they would drift, and that's okay. I mean, I can track that, but it's kind of funny. And usually they drift in a single direction, like they'll drift down or they'll drift up. It's kind of funny. Any questions about that? All right. Another thing we do is give signal reports. And in CW, we give RST reports. And in phone, we just give RS reports. So the best report you can give somebody is in CW is a 599. It means the signal is perfectly readable. You got really strong signals, and the tone of the thing is perfect. Nice, clean, single frequency tone. Most times in CW nowadays, you give everybody a 9. Why is that? Because we're operating off regulated DC power supplies now. So there's the tone is a measure of how much AC is still in the signal. Remember we talked in the power supply when we talked about power supplies, you get that ripple, Well, with regulated power supplies, you get very little ripple, and the tone is almost always perfect. If it's not, then something else is really wrong with that station, or they're using older equipment, you know. But 599 on phone, you give a 59, or sometimes they'll say 59, and because there's no tone in a phone signal, right? It's whatever somebody's voice is. There's no objective way to comment on somebody's tone of voice. So we leave that off. And you know, we said this is another kind of strange thing. In a lot of contests, part of the exchange will be a signal report. Well, if it's a CW contest, it's always 599. If it's a phone contest, it's always 59, no matter how strong or weak the signals actually are. Why we do that, I don't know. They should. A lot of contests have eliminated the signal report now and gone to a serial number, which makes a lot more sense. But some contests still use the signal report. There's some letters you can tack onto this. One of them is C, and this again only makes sense in a CW contact. But C stands for chirp. And what happens if a signal is chirpy? What happens is when they key down, when they send a dit or a da, the frequency of the transmitter will change a little bit. So it'll go ee, 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 and that's the chirp. And again, with modern radios, you rarely hear any kind of chirp. If you hear a chirp on somebody's signal, it's because they're using older tube type gear, and which sometimes can chirp. And you want to tell the person that, because a lot of times these people that are using vintage equipment, they're using it because they fixed it up, and they're proud of the fact that they could do that and that they did a good job on it. And the fact that there's some chirp means they didn't probably do as good a job as they thought, and they want to know that. So always tell them if there's chirp or if they're drifting. I always do that. One time the guy's signal was kind of bad, and he asked me about it. He said, "Well, I got any chirp on the signal?" And I kind of hesitated because it wasn't that bad. It wasn't objectionable. But since he asked, I said, "Yeah, there's a little bit of chirp there." So I was glad he asked. Any questions about that? All right. Q signals. So there's Q signals that we use in CW. And again, it's mostly CW, although some of this has filtered into phone contacts. But these are 3-letter combinations that begin with the letter Q, and they stand for whole phrases. And it really makes a CW contact go much faster. So some of the ones we already talked a little, we already talked a little bit about QRL. QRM, that means that there's some interference. So if I send you QRM, that means you're being interfered with. And this turns up on phone often. You hear somebody say, "Yeah, there's QRM on the frequency." And this is all like you shouldn't be using Q signals on phone, but we do, just because it's sort of become part of the jargon. QRN, actually, that's not what this means. It means there's noise. Is there noise on, and mostly atmospheric noise. So again, QRN, somebody will say, "Yeah, there's a lot of QRN tonight." It means there's a lot of noise on the bands. QRO is increased power, QRP decreased power. this has become a common part of the lexicon. We often say QRP rig, right, to mean a low power rig. QRS, if you're going to start doing CW, you might want to remember that. That means send slower. QRT, sometimes we'll say, even on phone, we'll say, I'm going QRT. That means I'm going to stop transmitting. What else is here? QSY we talked about. QTH, that's often used. A lot of these aren't even used. I don't know why they put them on this chart. We never say QTR anymore. I didn't even know what that meant. QTS, we don't do that. QUB, QUM, QSD. We should use this more because some guys there do send pretty badly, but we usually don't send that. QSB, we do use this one a lot. So questions. What should you do if a station sends QRS? Answer, send slower. Question, what does the Q signal QSL mean? Answer, I acknowledge receipt. So actually, we say that often a lot in phone too. That if you're sending some information, somebody will say QSL. And we'll use that on CW a lot. So this is where we get the QSL cards from, right? Question, what does this Q signal QRN mean? Answer, I am troubled by static, or there is atmospheric noise. Question, what does the Q signal QRV mean? Answer, I am ready to receive messages. You know, we don't really, and that's not even on this chart here, right? QRV is used if you're doing formal message traffic, but other than that, I've never used it in a regular contact. Any questions about Q signals? All right. Where's my... I got pro sign. So we have Q signals. They stand for certain phrases or questions, but we also use these things called pro signs, short for procedural signals. And they often either call for an action or say you're going to take some kind of action. CQ is one of them, okay? K is another. So, you know, if you're going to turn, you know, in the contact, you take turns sending messages or sending to one another. If you're ready to turn it over to somebody else to have them start sending, you'll send a K. Oops. You'll send K. So if I'm talking to Casey here on CW, I'll say at the end of my transmission, I'll send KE8PFA VE from KB6NU K. That K means for Casey then to start transmitting. And although this doesn't happen a lot, that means any station can transmit. So if somebody wanted to break into our CW contact, they could send their call sign real fast and they would break into our contact. If for some reason I didn't want anybody to break in, I just wanted Casey then to start sending, I would send KN instead. That means for only him to start transmitting. And then these are all other ones. You send an R, meaning you in a contact for when you've received everything from the other station okay. This means stand by or wait. You send these two at the end of a contact. So these are procedural signals or pro signs. Question, what does it mean when a CW operator sends KN at the end of a transmission? Answer, listening only for a specific station or stations. And this happens a lot. They use this. We don't use this much in regular contacts, but they'll use it in nets. So if you have a CW net, then they'll go to each station in turn, right? And they'll send KN because they only want that station to transmit. I checked into a CW net just last night, and that's what they did. Question: what pro sign is sent to indicate the end of a formal message when using CW? Answer: AR. So that's this, and mostly it's used in formal traffic handling. But sometimes you'll hear it in regular contexts as well. Any questions about this? I'm going to go back to this for just a second. The Q signals. So one of the Q signals here is QSK. And that means I can hear you between signals, or can you hear me between signals? And so question: which of the following describes full break-in telegraphy? QSK. Answer: transmitting stations can receive between code characters and elements. So even though I'm sending dits and das, even between those dits and das, my receiver kicks in and I can hear anything that's on the frequency. So somebody could break in while I'm still sending, and I'll hear them and then let them transmit. And once you get real good at CW, then people actually start doing this. At really slow speeds, you don't really do it that much because you don't have the skill yet to quite do that. But at high speeds, people do that a fair amount. Any questions? All right, let's take a 5-minute break. I need to get a drink of water. We only have a few more pages left, so we'll get done with plenty of time. Resume recording. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about here is the volunteer monitor program. And this is a sort of a successor to what used to be called the official observer program. And this program is the whole idea of this program is to have a core of amateur radio operators who are trained to monitor the bands, and then look for people that are violating the rules, or in some way, or have signals that don't meet the technical requirements, and to basically to self-police the amateur radio bands. So question: what is the volunteer monitoring program? Answer: amateur volunteers who are formally enlisted to monitor the airwaves for rules violations. Question: which of the following are objectives of the volunteer monitoring program? Answer: to encourage amateur radio operators to self-regulate and comply with the rules. Question: what skills learning, let me start again. What skills learned during hidden transmitter hunts are of help to the volunteer monitoring program? Answer: direction finding used to locate stations violating FCC rules. So I actually got a notice from the predecessor program, the Official Observers. Once I started getting back on the air, I set up my station, and what happened was to save space, I had a power supply on top, and on top of that, I set my radio. So here's the power supply. Here's the radio. It was an IC 735. And getting back to the RST, every once in a while I'd get a report like 568 or 477. Just saying that there was some AC in my signal. And then I actually got an official observer. It's like a little QSL card almost, and it's from the official observer. And the guy said, you got a bad tone on your signal. It was. I sometimes joke it was one of the first QSL cards I got when I got back in the ham radio. And he suggested, well, maybe the power supply had bad capacitors and wasn't filtering the AC out enough. And he may have had another suggestion. I don't know. But the trick was setting the radio on top of the power supply was not a good idea. So this is a linear power supply, right? So it had a big transformer in it. Well, what happens when you put AC through a coil? You get a magnetic field that happens to increase and decrease at 60 hertz. Well, somehow, even though I thought all this was metal, and there's metal cabinet here, metal cabinet on the power supply, this was obviously a big enough field that it was actually somehow affecting the inner circuits of this IC 735. So the trick was to move the radio, some feet away, and my problem went away. But the point here is it was the official observers, or in this case it would be the volunteer monitors, who would find that and send me a gentle reminder. The other thing about this volunteer monitor program, I've written about this on my blog. I always wondered why they needed to go to a different name for this, because the official observers, that was a good name for one thing, and they had a good group of people, it seemed to me, but I don't know. They decided to shake it up. Apparently they weren't all as good as I thought.
Did something else change when they changed their name?
Yeah, so before, official observers would kind of report things to the FCC if it was, they didn't get the results they were looking for. And now they've changed the way the reports go. The reports are funneled into the ARRL and then to the FCC. So the reporting structure changed a little bit, but I don't know. It seems like they made a too drastic a change to me. But that's ARRL politics. I said I wasn't going to talk about politics today. So next we'll talk about the Azimuthal map. So this is a map, and you can buy this map from like this guy here. This is the owner of this company, axlesyandantennas.com. Don't ask me how he got that name, but he'll generate these maps for you. And this is sort of a generic azimuthal map, and they're usually centered on the center of the U.S. You can buy like one of those from the ARRL. And the reason these are kind of cool is that they are like a more accurate projection of the world than a regular map is, where north is on top and south is on the bottom. So in this map, every place on this map is as far from you as they would be like in real life, if that makes any sense. Like you could lay out a ruler on here and then go to the scale and find out exactly how far it is from you to like New Zealand down here. The other thing this shows you is the true bearing you'd point an antenna to reach that location, right? So if you, on a regular map, well, everything in Europe is like to the east or maybe a little northeast. But you can see here, you know, like to get to Norway or Sweden here, to use a Nordic reference, you're almost straight north here. You're not just northwest, you're almost straight north. So, and the numbers around, you can't really see it too well in this, but the numbers around the edge of the map are bearings, you know, bearings for that you turn your antenna to. So this map is very useful. And like I say, this guy here, the CQ maps, he'll generate one specifically for your location. But you can buy them from the ARRL where they have, you know, like the middle of Kansas as the center, and that's pretty good for, you know, pretty close for anything in the U.S. That's the azimuthal projection map. So question, which of the following describes an azimuthal projection map? Answer, a map that shows true bearings and distances from a particular location. Question, how is a directional antenna pointed when making a long path contact with another station? Answer, 180 degrees from the station's short path heading. So here, it would be good to use a azimuthal map for that, right? So let's use Sweden again as an example. So from us to Sweden, let's see what if I can read that. It's about 25 degrees. And that's exactly how you do it. You draw a straight line through the location and then to the edge of the map. So, well, see, that's probably more like 22 degrees. That would be the short path, right? You know, from here to here, short path. To reach that location long path, it'd be 180 degrees in the opposite direction. So this way, and that's about 202 degrees. And that signal would travel all the way around the world. Now, if you go to, here's another kind of cool thing. If you go to qrz.com and look up a station, like the other day I talked to IK6JOT. And let me just do this. Got time to do this. Oh, come on. I was watching a video on satellites earlier. So I don't know if you guys know about qrz.com, but this is a great website. You can look up people on this website. So, you know, all you got to do is type in their call sign. So I talked to IK6JOT. And I'm logged in, so it knows where I am, right? See, I'm logged in here. If you go to detail, it tells you what bearing to point your antenna. It says the distance from my house to his location, and then the long path distance. So you almost don't need an azimuthal projection map if you got access to qrz.com. But you know, having one of those maps is kind of cool. Plus, you can zoom in on their location here. This is the Google map. You can, well, let's do this. You get a little bit bigger map here. You can zoom out and see exactly where they're located. So that's where this person was located. Or you can zoom in and even, let's see, this, yeah, so you can even sort of find their house and everything. it's kind of cool. Google Maps is amazing. This all makes use of Google Maps. And let's see, you can even find a good fish restaurant near their house. Anyway, that's qrz.com. It's really a great resource. people complain about this because the website design is kind of antique, but it's good information here. All right, let's go back to any questions about that? All right, here's kind of a question sort of out of the blue. Which of the following is typical of the lower HF frequencies during the summer? Answer, high levels of atmospheric noise. You know, you got thunderstorms in the summertime, so you got atmospheric noise. One thing that's kind of cool, well, I don't know if it's cool, but one phenomena you can notice is you can tell how good the band conditions are by how loud the static crashes are. You know, what happens during a lightning strike? Well, it generates a lot of radio frequency, electromagnetic radiation. And, you know, if you're on 40 meters and you're hearing a lot of static, but you're not, you know, there's no storm where you are, well, that means that static is coming from somewhere and it's probably bouncing off the ionosphere to get to you. So sometimes, you know, you'll talk to somebody and like from here, I talk in the New England quite a bit in New York, and they'll say, oh yeah, we got a thunderstorm here today, or, you know, it's storming here. And I can hear that storm. And if I can hear the storm really well, that means the conditions are really good. So it's kind of like a two-edged sword. The conditions are good, but that means I'm hearing more of the static. So, but it's an interesting phenomenon. It's something that's interesting to hear. I was going to cover that before. Some standard procedures. You know, we use the NATO alphabet, right, for phonetic alphabet, and, you know, on phone, you know, it's best to use the phonetic alphabet, especially when calling CQ or in contest, because very easy to misunderstand the letter. So, question, which of the following are examples of the NATO phonetic alphabet? And it's suggested that we use the NATO phonetic alphabet, although there are a bunch of different phonetic alphabets, oddly enough. So the suggested one is NATO, but then there's the Army one, which is a little bit different. I forget how, but it's different. And then there's one that's common in amateur radio called the DX phonetic alphabet. So this says, this is, you know, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie. But the DXers, they'll use, and this it's not a standard, but they'll use like place names, like H, and I forget what the A, B, and C are, unfortunately. But L would be London. They'll say London instead of Lima. They'll say Honolulu instead of whatever, hotel. Honolulu. In this, the Z is Zulu. Here they'll say Zanzibar. So if you hear that, then you kind of know what's going on there. These are DXers, and they're used to using these DX phonetic alphabets. But NATO is the preferred one, and answer to that question is Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta. I should have moved the CQ question to the CQ section, but question, which of the following is a good way to indicate on a clear frequency in the HF phone bands that you are looking for a contact with any station? Answer, repeat CQ a few times, followed by this is, then your call sign a few times, then pause to listen. Repeat as necessary. Sort of a random contest question here. Which of the following is required when participating in a contest on HF frequencies? Answer, identify your station per normal FCC regulations. Well, what does that mean? Now, the regulations say you need to identify your station every 10 minutes or at the end of a contact. So, it's, in a contest, you're making contacts one right after the other. Technically, you're supposed to identify your station after every contact. Does that happen? No, not all the time. So, and that's kind of frustrating sometimes. Sometimes you'll hear a station that you think you might want to contact, but they're not giving their call sign after every contact. So you have to wait there, or not, as the case may be, wait until they actually do identify. Because otherwise, you can't log them if you can't identify them, that kind of thing. Any questions?
Is there any signal you would give to indicate it's the end of your transmission besides your call sign, like this is Jim out?
I mean, during a contest?
During any transmission to indicate, maybe the end of a conversation?
Well, like on phone, what I'll do sometimes is just say 73. In fact, we didn't talk about that at all. This is a good thing to say. So there's a few, and actually 73 and there's two, 73 and 88. These come from the Phillips code, which is a telegraphy thing. There's a whole bunch of numbers that the telegraphers used to send for common messages, common phrases used in telegrams, right? This stands for best regards. And in ham radio, we use 73 when we said, basically we're saying like goodbye, right? We'll say 73. This is love and kisses. And this isn't used as much anymore, but sometimes, if the two stations were, related to one another, sometimes they might send that to make it a little bit more intimate, especially if it was between the two stations where a man and a woman, they might do that. We don't use this too much anymore, but that sometimes you'll hear that. You'll hear 88. But these are the only two. I mean, there are all kinds of other ones like happy birthday and, other kind of things. And the telegraphers would send these numbers instead of sending the whole, all the characters. That's just to save time on the wire. But 73 really is about the only one that survives, sometimes 88. But so to get back to your question, that's what we'll say at the end of a transmission. We'll say 73.
Very good, thanks.
Yeah. And then on CW, sometimes you'll, like if you remember that pro signs, they'll send CL. That means closing the station. So things are a little bit more formal in CW sometimes. All right. Any other questions about that? One of the things that, I mentioned this before, the question here is, what is QRP operation? Answer, low power transmit operation. And that comes from the Q signal QRP, which means to reduce power. And finally, one question on logging. Even though there's no requirement anymore to keep a log, except in some really oddball cases, like you need to keep a record of your effective radiated power if you're operating on 60 meters. That's, like I said, is pretty special case. I think it's a good idea always to keep a log book, especially for HF contacts. And there's a number of reasons for that. It's like a nice thing to have. Keep a record of. If somebody sends you a QSL card, that's the only way you can verify if the QSL card is a good one. Is if you kept a log. And then, the answer to this question, what is a reason why many amateurs keep a station log? Answer: to help with a reply if the FCC requests information. So, if you remember the last question, well, you all weren't in my tech class, but the last question I cover on the tech test is, what is one thing you must do if requested by the FCC? And the answer is something like, make your station available for inspection if requested to do so. And if the FCC can do this, there's no, that's in the rules. And if you keep a station log, it'll help you reply if the FCC asks you questions about your station operation. If you have a log, you can refer to that. Another thing that it helps with, not only FCC, but with neighbors. If your neighbor is accusing you of causing interference to their TV reception or something, you can look in your log to see if you were even operating at the time they think you were interfering with them. That's another good reason to keep a log. So it's good to keep a log, especially now that there's a number of different logging programs out there that are all computerized. So, and that brings some nice features. Like, for example, the computerized program I use will pull up, like I type in a call sign for somebody I'm just contacted, and then it'll then pull up all the instances of previous contacts, and it'll show it to me. So I can tell, like today, I talked to N1MX. His name's Mike. So right off the bat, I already knew his name because it pulled up this information for me. And then B, I could say, yeah, Mike, hey, we last talked on May 9th, 2020, or whatever it was. And so that's kind of amusing. Sometimes you can say, yeah, Joe, we've this is our 50th contact, and the first one was back in 2002, whatever the information is. So that's kind of amusing. Any questions about logs?
Dan, does the QRZ log count as a log?
It does, but it's not really. I wouldn't use it exclusively. Because it doesn't really have the features, and you have to be at a place where you have internet access. With the other one, you just need the computer, and it'll keep all the information on your computer. Does that make sense?
Yep.
All right. All right. Let's go back here for a second. Oops. So now we'll talk a little bit about digital operating procedures. It relates to the band plan, because there's certain areas where data is where you find data mostly. If you look at the FCC frequency allocation chart from the ARRL, you'll see that data, CW and data share the same frequency allocations. So like on 40 meters, that's 7.000 to 7.125. Those are all, that whole area is allowable to operate CW or data in. But chances are you don't want to operate data below 7080, just because that's the voluntary band plan part. This 7040 is, for some reason, the whisper people have glommed onto that frequency. So it says data, but it's really this whisper. And it's teletype in region 1. We're in region 2, right? Region 1, because they don't have, in region 1, they only have 7.0 to 7.2, not 7.3 megahertz. Anyway, it's kind of complicated, but even though data is allowed in this portion, you want to stay above 70, 80 mostly. So these are all questions like that. Question, what segment of the 20-meter band is most often used for digital transmissions, avoiding the DX propagation beacons? Answer, 14.070 to 14.112. This is the digital portion. Question, in what segment of the 20-meter band are most PSK31 operations commonly found? Answer, below the RTTY segment, around 14.070. So PSK31 in there. And I should have, also put those out here too. Question, what segment of the 80-meter band is most commonly used for digital transmissions? Answer, 3585 to 3600. And I should have put the 80-meter band here too, but the way 80 meters is nowadays, 3.5 to 4.0. The CW and data portion is now only 3.5 to 3.6. So there's only 100 kilohertz here. The rest here is all phone. And usually what happens is the digital is in the top portion of the data CW portion. So this is where the digital is on 80 meters. Any questions about that? All right, so a couple of questions here about, let me get rid of these. Teletype. So radio teletype, if you recall, is a frequency shift keying, right? So it's shifting between two frequencies. These frequencies are 170 hertz apart. So question, and that's called the frequency shift. And if you looked at it, and I should have got a actual waterfall here. If you look at it on a waterfall, you'll see these signals. So, if this was 3 kilohertz wide, it's not to scale, you know that this was a sideband signal. A single line here, that's probably a CW signal. If you have 2 lines here that are 170 hertz apart, that's probably an RTTY signal. So question, what is the most common frequency shift for RTTY emissions in the amateur HF band? 170 hertz. And these will be exactly 170 hertz on the waterfall. There's 2 ways to send teletype. One is frequency shift keying or audio frequency shift keying, right? In this case, we're using the tones sent from a sound card. Here we're actually shifting the frequency of the VFO. Here we're using the audio from a sound card to shift the signal back and forth. So question, which mode is normally used when sending RTTY signals via AFSK with an SSB transmitter? Answer, lower sideband or LSB. Question, what is the standard sideband used to generate a JT65, JT9, or FT8 digital signal when using AFSK in any amateur band? Answer, upper sideband. So for RTTY, you use lower sideband, and that's on any band, not just 160, 40, and 80, right? So all bands. Why is that? It's just what we've been doing. You know, it's just the common practice. And then basically all other digital modes, you use upper sideband. And why is that teletype the outlier here? Because we've been doing it a lot longer than all the other digital modes. I mean, teletype has been around since, well, like the 1930s, I think, even. In those days, we were using analog tone generation and tone detection to drive mechanical machines. Now we're doing it all in a computer. But any questions? You know, I've said this before, but the one program you might want to check out is a program called FL Digi. It can do all kinds of digital modes. The only things it doesn't do are like the WSJT modes, but you know, it does teletype and it does PSK31 and you know, all kinds of other. There must be about 24 digital modes, you know, and they'll do them all, and it's free, you know. So you get a hold of this and play around with it. It's pretty cool. Any questions about this? You know, even if you don't want to send teletype, with this you can receive it, you know. You see PSK31. You can do all that even before you get a license. All right. D connectors. One question on D connectors here. Question, which of the following connectors would be a good choice for a serial data port? Answer, DE9. It's this one right here. So a lot of people like to will say DB9. And why do they do that? Because of the DB25 connector. The DB25 connector was like the most common connector especially in the early days of computers. You used DB25s for all the serial ports. You know, there's all kinds. I mean, there's 25 different signal lines in there too. You didn't use most of them, even back in the day. So that's why they came up with these DB9 and DB15 connectors, or I think that's. See, they even got this wrong here. I just noticed that. See, they're calling it a DB9, but it's actually DE9. And so each of these is properly a different letter as well as a different number. So it's doubly redundant. So DE, it's always DE9. E and 9 are always related. DB25. So B and 25, that's the redundancy here. DA15. They actually used to call it a D in the previous question pools. This was called a DB9 connector, but technically it's a DE9 connector. If you ever go to a like a nerd bar, you could maybe win a few bucks by betting on that, whether DB9 or DE9 is the proper designation. Any questions about that? All right. I talked about the WSJT suite. So this is the software that has FT8, FT4, JT9. There's a whole raft of them now. They've even come out with some new ones for the 630 meter and 2200 meter band. Somehow they've I don't know all the details, but they've tweaked the protocol to make it more useful on these really low frequency bands. So sometimes I joke that they come out with the digital mode du jour, because almost seems like almost every day they've got a new one. Question: which of the following is characteristic of the FT8 mode of the WSJT-X family? Answer: typical exchanges are limited to call signs, grid locators, and signal reports. So that's how they get it to be so fast. So FT8 takes 30 seconds. FT4 takes 15 seconds. And that's the only information they exchange: call signs, grid locators, and signal reports. One of the ways that it gets such great performance is that the receiving and the transmitting stations are time synchronized, right? And synchronized to some internet source. Question: which of the following is a requirement when using the FT8 digital mode? Answer: computer time accurate within approximately 1 second. So the transmitter and the receiver have to be within 1 second of one another. That's so the receiver knows when to start looking for signals and the transmitter knows when to send the signals. Any questions? I should have moved this to the teletype, other group this with the other teletype questions. But question: what could be wrong if you cannot decode an RTTY or other FSK signal, even though it is apparently tuned in properly? Answer: the mark and space frequencies may be reversed. So remember, there's two frequencies, right? One's called the mark, one's called the space. And most software will let you, and this roughly corresponds to ones and zeros, right? But most software will let you flip the two. So the mark becomes the 0 and the space becomes the 1. That's the answer to this question. Or, the answer is all these choices are correct. The mark and space frequencies may be reversed. You may have selected the wrong baud rate, so that the rate at which the data is being transferred. And most amateur radio stuff is 45 baud. Or you may be listening on the wrong sideband. So remember I said RTTY is LSB. If you have your radio set to USB, then you're not going to get any reception. Any questions about that? All right. Oops. Talk about WinLink. WinLink has got a lot of publicity lately. Several reasons. It was used in Hurricane Maria quite extensively, and it's a method of sending digital data over HF radio and more. You can send over VHF and UHF as well, right? But it's mostly used on HF now. And this is sort of a high-level view of a WinLink network. It uses the internet, but it also uses radio links to send and receive information. One of the points of controversy here is that these radios are automatically controlled. So if it gets some signal that it is being told to send the signal, this radio may just start up and it may cause some interference to somebody because it's automatically controlled. So that's been a point of contention. That really hasn't panned out as badly as some thought it would. So that controversy has kind of died down a little, but you still hear it every once in a while. The fact that it's automatically controlled and Yeah. So question, which communication system sometimes uses the internet to transfer messages? Answer, WinLink. Question, which of the following is a way to establish contact with a digital messaging system gateway station? And that's what these are here. They're gateways. Answer, transmit a connect message on the station's published frequency. So these things will be monitoring a particular frequency, and when it gets a connect message, then it connects and you can send data. Mostly email. It mostly is used to send email. Okay, WinLink is sort of the Uber design here, the network. WinLink uses the PACTOR protocol to actually send and receive messages. Question, how can a PACTOR modem or controller be used to determine if the channel is in use by other PACTOR stations? Answer, see here at PACTOR right here. Answer, put the modem or controller in a mode which allows monitoring communications without a connection. So that was sort of the answer to the automatic control controversy, is to build in a method by which it would monitor the frequency before it started transmitting. Again, it's kind of like listening and asking if the frequency is in use before calling CQ, right? Question, what symptoms may result from other signals interfering with a PACTOR or WinMore transmission? Answer, all of these choices are correct. Frequent retries or timeouts. PACTOR has a method by which it'll detect if there's been a data error and request a retransmission. So if you have a frequent retries or timeouts, then you know that this link is probably not all that good. Answer, long pauses in message transmission. Failure to establish a connection between stations. So, it's HF communications here. So, it's got all the problems of HF transmission, fading and propagation changes, all that stuff. And finally, how do you join a contact between two stations using the PACTOR protocol? Answer, joining an existing contact is not possible. PACTOR connections are limited to two stations. They sort of do a handshake with one another, and then only the two stations will really be able to talk to one another. So a third station can't break in. Even if it's a digital station. If that makes any sense. That was another kind of complaint against PACTOR, is that, well, a third party couldn't monitor the communication going on here because these two did handshaking, and only the one could basically interpret what the other one was sending. But they made some changes in the software again to allow third stations to sort of monitor these communications. And why is that important? Well, again, you want to be, ham radio is supposed to be totally open and transparent. You might want to monitor that transmission to make sure nothing untoward is being sent over an amateur radio link. All right, any questions about anything? That's the end of the material for today. All right, no questions. Have a good evening. You can maybe catch the last bit of the debate or
What are we doing? What are we doing on Monday?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask me that question. hang on. Amateur radio practices. And what's in that chapter is like stuff about setting up your station.
All right, thanks, Dan. Good night.
All right.
Thanks.
Good night,
Good night.
everybody. Have a good
Good
week.
night, Dan.
Take
Thank you.
practice tests.
Good night, Dan. Thanks a lot.
Du får komma fram sen.
Ja. What's up? What is
Ja.